Hello and welcome back to this downful idealistic crusade. As a lifelong fan of the James Bond series in both the literary James Bond of the novels and the James Bond film series, it's absolutely essential that I get my thoughts into video form, and my severe disappointment and I'm still flabbergasted that Ian Fleming Publications has decided to selectively edit and censor and change the text of Ian Fleming's original James Bond novels. It was exciting news that IFP was going to do the 70th anniversary rollout and reissue of the novels, and had finally regained all of the publishing rights to the Fleming James Bond canon. And I was like many of the other literary Bond fans, which unfortunately seems like fans of the literary James Bond are a much smaller core group of the overall James Bond fandom, because most people focus and talk about the films. And unfortunately, especially with the attitudes a lot of publishers have towards publishing the novels and the continuation books in a very low-key manner, especially here in the U.S., the literary Bond is not treated very well at all by publishers. It's always it felt as if you're a fan of the literary James Bond, you're much more of a smaller group of the overall James Bond fandom, because you're not able to talk about the books as much as you are the films, because everyone knows the films. But to know that IFP was going to be reissuing the books and doing various editions and probably some special editions and things as part of this 7th anniversary rollout to celebrate the anniversary of Casino Royale in 1953, and that it was the estate handling this and the family handling this. It just had this feeling of, oh wow, this will be something special. And anyone who knows me or has seen my channel, or I've done videos on my James Bond book collection and all the various editions I have hundreds of James Bond books and different editions, and it's one of my most cherished parts of my overall book collection. It's one of the first things I ever started collecting in terms of book editions were the various James Bond printings. I buy and read every continuation novel as soon as it comes out, and I reread the continuation novels, which I know not a lot of people do, even in the literary Bond fandom. So I was considering, once these new editions came out, I always want to support James Bond publishers where possible. So if I was strongly considering maybe purchasing some of these new editions, especially if they did some lovely special releases or packages, if they were affordably priced, which is usually the thing that keeps me from getting into things like the beautiful Folio Society editions and other things like that. But it was announced in a news article recently, and it's sort of spread across the internet like wildfire, and because it's been reported on many times now, and now IFP has released an additional statement to clarify. But essentially what has been done is to go through the novels and selectively choose to alter and change some of the what is today considered offensive content. And that is understandable in theory, and anyone who reads Fleming's Bond novels will know from the first paragraph, from the first page, that these were books written, now we're talking 70 years ago. They are of a different time and place. So obviously, you have to look at them with historical context, and there are going to be references and passages that will cause, any sensible reader some pause, or, definitely moments where you will cringe at some of the outdated language and references. But this is going to be something you come across in any work of a particular era, regardless of what decade you might be talking about. And that's why any sort of sensible reprint or reissue of material of a different time, if that is a consideration on the publisher's part, That's why you see well-worded disclaimers at the start of books. This is also carried over into some home video releases, where they have, for historical preservation's sake, preserved the material as it was originally made and placed a disclaimer at the start. This has been done in books and printing for many decades, and all it requires is a simple disclaimer somewhere at the front of the book. I've started reading a lot more of the of pulp era reprints, since now there's so many great small independent publishers who are reprinting some of the great classic fiction of the pulp magazine era that has, for the most part, unfortunately, been lost to time. And they do wonderful jobs at preserving this incredible part of literary history that is usually swept under the rug. But since you're talking about material from the 20s and 30s primarily, it's going to be chock full of all kinds of things that would make a modern reader really cringe and have issues. So that's why you have a disclaimer. And just for reference, one of these, I wanted to try and pull some different references together instead of just ramble about my outrage. But here in the beautiful Sanctum Books reprint of the Whisperer classic pulp hero character, there is a simple disclaimer in the right on the front page in the copyright information, saying that this edition is an unabridged replication of the text and illustrations of two stories from The Whisperer, originally published in 1936 and 1937. This is a work of its time. Consequently, the text is reprinted intact in its original historical form, including occasional out-of-date ethnic and cultural stereotyping. That's all it takes. Something as simple as that. That's an example of a very simple and to the point disclaimer, but you can be a bit more well worded or add additional details if you wish. You could even make a page or a special introduction that's 2 or 3 pages long, acknowledging that none of this was ever proper, but at the time the work was created, unfortunately, this type of, say, cultural stereotyping or this inherent cultural racism or these views were commonplace. And to ignore this, to try and sweep it under the rug, is to pretend that it never existed. And the old adage of if you don't study history, you are doomed to repeat it, well, that applies here. That would be one thing, however, if that was the extent of the changes that were made. If it was simply removing offensive terms and replacing them with different terminology and going through the book selectively to find those and just replace those particular words. There is a history of this being done in literature in all different areas and with the Bond books as well. As an example of this being done, a couple years ago I finally started reading the classic Edgar Rice Burroughs Tarzan novels. And I wasn't aware until finding an article that had been written and prepared, but the original texts were slightly altered in this way of removing a handful of select terms and short, not really passages, but really just altering a sentence here and there that had, rather offensive terms and terminology for various paperback reprintings, including the classic 1970s and 80s Ballantine paperbacks. These are just 2 books I have, for example. Not all the books had this, but I will link to the article I found where somebody went through and posted comparisons in the various novels of the very select small portions and certain words and terms that were altered or changed without removing the integrity of the work or the passage or that part of the page. This type of select editing and trying to make things much more appropriate for later times when people are much more aware of how offensive that is, that's understandable, and you have to be very careful at the same time to not alter the integrity of the original work. And Burroughs when he was writing the Tarzan novels, well, that's going all the way back to the 1910s. So you can imagine the amount of dated material is, of course, much greater because you're talking about, say, a work from 1912 as compared to Fleming's second Bond novel, Live and Let Die, from 1954. Now, this novel is definitely the most infamous in regards to this topic among the literary Bond fandom because it is primarily set in and around black culture at the time in 1954. You have Bond and Felix Leiter going to Harlem, and the novel winds up concluding in Jamaica. And unfortunately, throughout there is examples of cultural stereotyping, except notably the lead villain of Mr. Big is an intelligent and very menacing villain. And for me, growing up reading the novel, and I still think it is one of Fleming's best novels. I do think his more action adventure type novels like Live and Let Die are severely underrated because there are really two types of Fleming Bond novels: the more early action adventure oriented ones, and then the later ones where he's really trying to aspire to more literary type grandeur. Here in Live and Let Die, it's honestly the more vintage materials you read where you're going to come across this unfortunate cultural stereotyping that's pretty much just baked into a lot of things, the more examples you come across, the more you're going to get that historical context and realize that unfortunately this was just kind of everywhere. And it is rather insightful for Fleming to at least try to give a sense of black culture, especially the passage where Bond and Felix go to Harlem in the early 1950s. And again, you have an example of a very strong villain in Mr. Big, who is not a stereotype or a caricature, but you pretty much see that in all the other supporting characters that pop up, and that's going to be something that is very much commonplace, unfortunately, in a good majority of literature. Whenever there is a black character involved in any sort of role, and this, of course, goes into films of the classic Hollywood studio period, it was just unfortunately part of the cultural mindset. And again, going to the idea of to pretend this never existed, you're doomed to repeat this type of material, and these things need to be understood and acknowledged so we can recognize that unfortunately this was part of history, and these things used to exist and were not seen as hideously offensive as they were. But with Live and Let Die, it was not published in its original text form here in the U.S. This is my childhood copy of the U.S. 60s Signet paperback, which contains the U.S. text edition. When Fleming submitted his manuscript, and then it was passed over to the U.S. editors, fortunately, the editor in charge of the U.S. editions, and this was for the original U.S. publication in the 1950s, recognized that this did contain material that would even then have caused some offense, and also found that there were a few errors here and there in terms of Fleming's research and trying to get all of the particular American location details just right. So he suggested some minute changes to fix a few of those errors, and to also alter and lessen the certain bits that really were much more offensive in the original UK text in terms of the cultural stereotype, and especially. So growing up, and for all these years, I was reading the U.S. edition like most people were, and this became the sort of de facto text for a lot of editions for a long time. And it really wasn't until around 2002, when Penguin started reprinting the books, that it reverted to the UK text. So I have one of the more modern UK paperbacks, which has the original UK text. It's mostly the same. It's just certain key select moments, and particularly Yeah, and in particular focus is the one particular chapter, which also had its name changed, which of course is chapter 5, which in the U.S. edition has the title of Seventh Avenue, which of course is where Bond and Felix find themselves in Harlem trying to follow the trail of Mr. Big. Well, in the UK text, it has a very different title and a very offensive one. I never understood why Fleming chose that as a title until discovering that it was actually a reference to a book of the same title that was written during the Harlem Renaissance period. So it was actually a literary reference, which, again, I just was not aware of until I tried to figure out why Fleming would choose such a seemingly horrible title. Then the primary alteration is a particular passage where ostensibly Fleming was trying to capture the spirit of what the people in these Harlem night spots would be doing. And there's this particular long passage in the UK text where Bond and Leiter overhear a conversation that's being had. And when you read the passage, it is unfortunately full of what you'll see commonplace in texts with cultural stereotyping. So it has the sort of broken grammar, and the spelling is done in a certain way to suggest the diction of the person talking. And again, you're going to find this unfortunately in most literary works of the past where you're running into cultural stereotyping. What Fleming was trying to do, I believe, is give a sense of the place and time, but unfortunately, that has all of the terrible cultural stereotyping built in. So I was very surprised, and that the UK text did come back into print and was in all the modern editions, and that's how I finally got to read the chapter. And again, I think you can see what Fleming was going for, but I do truly appreciate the U.S. text alterations, and I really do think the U.S. text does read better. I think it was a very smart idea to make those little tweaks. And so the U.S. text has sort of been the de facto version swapping around with the UK text all these years. So if you have a particular edition, sometimes it's the UK text and sometimes it's the US one. Now, why this is important is IFP has said they took this idea, this notion, and they have retroactively, now in 2023, applied the same core tenets and ideas of the U.S. text alterations to Live and Let Die to all the other novels. The problem is, not only is this selective, and they are choosing what they're going to remove, and already it's been said that they have only chosen to alter or remove certain offensive material, but not all offensive material. So they're going to be, it's going to be a very weird hodgepodge of things that are changed, but then other stuff's going to be there. So that, again, underlines the fact that this is being done selectively. It was said that they consulted a sensitivity readers group who went through and suggested changes and sort of highlighted everything that was felt offensive in 2023. The problem with this is, of course, that the original author is no longer around to supervise or participate in this. Whereas in 1954, when Live and Let Die was changed slightly for the U.S. edition, it was done with Fleming's participation and approval, and his actual thanks. He wound up, he profusely thanked the U.S. editor for even suggesting this and pointing out the errors he had made, and was apparently very pleased with the U.S. text edit. And I do think it is actually an improvement on the UK text. But where this becomes a problem, it's not the situation I pointed out with the slight tweaks done to some of the reprints of the Tarzan novels in the 70s and 80s, where the rights holders were very careful to make selective changes to the terminology used to try and eliminate the most offensive material where possible without changing the integrity of the text. Here, if you read the IFP statements and you try to process what they're claiming and what they're actually saying to you, they have taken it upon themselves to go further than just changing terminology, but to also change other parts and passages as well. And that's where you start to get into, this isn't just censorship, this is revisionism, because you are changing the original writer's text, you are changing the flow of the prose, you are also, even in the smallest ways, altering the meaning. And something that Fleming was, I think, unparalleled in is his descriptive detail and his inherent wit and cynicism, and even describing to the minutest detail a room someone walks into, or the person he's dealing with, even when Bond goes through an airport terminal and is dealing with the customs official. It gives you a particular sense of place and time. And when you start changing that, you're not only lessening the impact, but you are second guessing prose that is up to 70 years old, and you're not consulting the original author, because the original author passed away in 1964. So he's no longer around to approve of or participate in making any changes. So this recently happened with the works of Roald Dahl, and that created a bit of a news story. And it's unfortunate for it to happen to anyone's work, regardless of the content being offensive or not. You are second guessing the original writer, and you are performing revisionism in addition to censorship. And then the question becomes, well, where do you stop? Where do you draw the line? How far will this go? Are you going to go back and censor and edit Shakespeare? Are you going to go back and censor and edit Dickens? Are you going to go back and censor and edit any of the classic literary works? Because they do contain material that is offensive to modern day readers and contain cultural stereotypes and things that people wouldn't do or think in 2023, when we hope we are more of an enlightened society. And also, in addition to that, if that wasn't enough, it's also insulting the reader's intelligence. It is saying that the reader or the audience is not intelligent enough to think for themselves and to realize that this is obviously outdated thinking and was never something that should have been thought or proposed or spread. I started reading the Bond novels when I was a child. I believe I first read Octopussy and the Living Daylights when I was 8, and my first Bond novel was Goldfinger when I was about 9 years old. And I was a child, and I could understand that these were from a different time and contained material that was not something anyone should ever think, believe, or say. It didn't detract from the overall experience and the literary significance of the works, but it was very plainly obvious, even when I was 9 years old, that these books contained materials that were of a particular place and time, when unfortunately cultural stereotyping prevailed, and this stuff was commonplace and not seen as again, hideously offensive as it is. I didn't have those terms as a 9-year-old. It wasn't as blatantly obvious as it is reading the books as an educated adult. But even as a 9-year-old, I could tell that there were pieces and passages of these books that were just plain bad. They contained parts of a section of our society that thankfully has evolved, and that you should be able to look at this material for yourself and be able to process it and realize just how detrimental and terrible this stuff is. Because if you're not able to do that, you're not going to recognize how bad that is, and that these elements used to exist and permeated society and culture at large, and you're not going to be able to grow or move past that. So again, I think even a child can read older materials and understand, at least in some shape or form, historical context, and that there will be materials that are obviously dated and offensive and stereotyping and racist. That's why a disclaimer is a perfectly fine and valid idea and has been done for decades. That it would be extremely helpful to anyone reading the books for the first time. That's not a problem, and that way you avoid censorship and second guessing an author's work and revisionism. This is not an example where an author re-edits their own work and makes slight changes and things, and then the edited version becomes the standard edition. For example, this is not a case like Mary Shelley rewriting Frankenstein in 1831 and making slight changes that alter the overall tone and impact of the novel as compared to the original 1818 text. Of course, this is the original author as an older, more experienced person years later reflecting and making changes to her previous work. I don't think, I think personally the edits and changes are inferior to the original text, but it's a fascinating comparison to make, and it was done by the original author herself. There are many examples of this throughout literature, but it was done and performed by the author themselves, not someone after the fact. The worst case of this occurring in all of literature, at least in my opinion, I think it's unparalleled, is what was done by the Stratemeyer Syndicate to the classic Hardy Boys novels. So the original 38 books, starting from the 1927 first book, The Tower Treasure, over a 15-year period starting in 1959, were completely reworked, re-edited, rewritten, and shortened by a significant page count by a variety of different authors in random order to what is known as the revised texts. Now, most of these do retain the same sort of plot idea and also the same title, but then others throw the original plot out entirely, and the only thing uniting them is that they have the same title and the same ghostwriter name. So if you picked up the copy of the book, you would have no idea that this had been done. It has been described as literary vandalism, which I think is a perfect term. And this was also done to the original Nancy Drew books up to that point in 1959 that had been published. But this was done for the first 38 Hardy Boys books of the original series. This is a replica reprint of the original 1927 text of The Tower Treasure. And the difference is staggering when you read the books, particularly by Leslie McFarlane, who really created the series. The McFarlane books read like novels, whereas while the revised texts are still beloved classics, they do have a different focus. They are much more action-oriented, and they have a significantly shorter page count. That was also done to cheapen the cost of printing books, because a smaller book is, cheaper to manufacture. But it was done and overseen by the syndicate that owned and controlled the books over a 15-year period. And again, some books were just completely ripped apart or thrown out entirely, and the only thing uniting them is the title. So that's really the worst case scenario for, I think, books being edited and or completely changed without the original author's participation. In short, these are works that are now, starting with Casino Royale, 70 years old. They are going to contain outdated materials, outdated modes of thought, things that are elements from our collective history that are painful to examine and to recognize that this used to be a major part of culture in the 1950s and 60s. But you need to be able to recognize those things. And they also, link these stories to the times in which they were written, because they were written in a particular place and time, about a particular place and time. Also, I consider Fleming to be one of the greatest authors in all of literature. I cannot tell you how many times, as a Bond fan, in literature classes in high school and college where I would try to reference Fleming or the Bond novels or write articles or papers about Fleming, and I would be laughed at by professors who refused to acknowledge that Fleming was a brilliant writer. And it has taken many decades for Fleming to even be considered properly as a great writer. For my own opinion, I consider, for me, Fleming is right there with Raymond Chandler as I think the greatest author who ever lived. But I am biased because I am a lifelong Bond obsessive. But he is a brilliant writer, and to second guess any great writer and to alter their work, it becomes a matter of where does this end? Where do you go with this? And do you go and censor works considered part of the world collective literary canon? I'm sure someone could read War and Peace and find elements they found objectionable and then want to go and censor or remove them and change Tolstoy's text. It becomes a matter of where does this stop? And again, it is insulting to the literary legacy of Ian Fleming, and it's insulting to the reader to say that, no, you are not intelligent enough to understand the notion of historical context and be able to think for yourself and understand that these ideas and elements are wrong and have always been wrong, but used to be a part of society and need to be recognized as part of history in order to avoid repeating the same mistakes. So that's why I'm a bit incensed, to be honest, and it's really it really stings because this is being done by the estate, by Fleming's heirs and the Fleming estate themselves, and they had finally gotten the publishing rights back, and it's the 70th anniversary to celebrate Fleming's literary genius and the literary bond, which should be something special because the literary bond is still not discussed enough. More people need to read the books and understand the literary bond is succinct and different to the cinematic James Bond. And it really stings. And I don't think any form of censorship or revisionism in terms of art should ever be done or performed. I think it is an abhorrible practice because it, and again, insults the audience intelligence. It always will alter in some way or fashion the original intent and experience of the work. And it tries to bury historical context and pretend as if these things never existed. So I don't think it's a good idea in any way, shape, or form. All that was required was a simple disclaimer. And you could even make it a full-blown introduction if you wanted to, where you really talked with the individual picking up the book for the first time. And this also becomes a problem because these versions will become the standard that's in print everywhere. This will be the version that is in bookstores. This will be the version people read as ebooks. This will be the version in libraries. And for all the claims that, oh, well, it's not a problem because you have all the other copies floating around and you can still get an old edition, that still doesn't solve the problem of the versions that people will have access to and the versions that newcomers will experience for however long these stay around will be these altered versions, and people will not be getting the original experience and the original text that the author wrote and intended. It is revisionism. You really do have to take the rough with the smooth. The rough elements of our collective past with the smooth in terms of the beauty of Fleming's prose and his beautiful observational wit and his dry cynicism that is unlike any other writer's voice, I think, in all of literature. That is the one absolute in terms of describing Fleming's prose, and that is his signature. That is his identifying characteristic that I think makes him one of the greatest writers who ever lived. No one is, of course, perfect, but the reason why I used the phrase "the rough with the smooth" not only was that the original title for Your Eyes Only, the short story collection, But I think it's a perfect description of how you have to look at any material of the past, any piece of art, any work of literature that is from a different time period. There are going to be rough elements. There are going to be things that stick out and make you wince or make you cringe reading along. But you need to be able to recognize that this was part of that time period, and it doesn't mean that it's something that you have to go along with, and you shouldn't, but it was part of that time, and it should be recognized as such in order to not repeat those same mistakes. So again, you must take the rough with the smooth. I can understand on one hand why IFP thought it might be necessary to do this to try and make the books more palatable to new readers today. However, I think it is entirely the wrong move and has been taken to a much greater degree than it should have ever been. I think the only thing that should have been done was to perhaps change some of the outdated offensive terms if you were going to change any of the text at all. I think using the U.S. text of Live and Let Die for new editions is a perfectly fine and valid idea. I personally myself would probably do that because it is, I think, an improvement on the UK text, and it was authorized by Fleming himself at the time of the book's original release. That is the only alternate version I think that should be used in modern editions of any of the novels. Every other novel should just simply have a disclaimer. And if you were to take it upon yourself to tweak or edit or change anything in the novels, I think the rule, the guideline should be something like I pointed out in some of the Tarzan reprints, where specific, very offensive terms were changed in terms of making them no longer an offensive term being utilized, but not changing the rest of the passage or the sentence. That is the only type of alteration that I think should be done in that sense. Otherwise, I think you need to just leave things alone and just put a simple disclaimer on it. And if the disclaimer makes someone trepidatious enough that they feel they might be offended by said work, then it is up to them to decide whether they want to read it or not. I think this is a terrible idea. It really does. It really hits me where I live in terms of being a lifelong Bond fan, but also being a lifelong reader and against any idea of censorship or revisionism in the art world. I think I really do think all Bond fans need to come together on this issue and sort of put our collective foot down. It's probably not going to be possible to get the reprints stopped. I think they're supposed to start coming out in April, but I think we collectively need to say these need to be ignored. No one should purchase them. No one should read the altered text. No libraries should order and have them on their shelves. No bookstores should buy or stock these for people to pick up. Basically, these need to just be ignored and swept under the rug. And even if IFP is going to do special limited editions or custom editions in some other fashion that contain the original unaltered text, it is... It's really just I don't really have words to describe I am perplexed and flabbergasted that they decided to do this, and these will become the versions in print. It has taken so long for Fleming to be recognized as a great writer in the literary world, and this unfortunately doesn't help that case either. So again, I am truly incensed. I get the idea, but they have taken it much too far. This is not a political argument in any sense of the word. This is simply a case of people decades after the fact taking it upon themselves to censor and revise texts and works by someone who had died in 1964 and second guessing them and doing it 70 years on. It is not something anyone should do, and it is altering and changing the original author's intent, no matter how you try and package or sell it. Again, these editions should not be read, sold, or put into libraries, and they should not be the versions that people have general access to. The original version should not be supplanted or suppressed. I experienced this myself because when I grew up, there were no Bond reprints, so I had to find copies in secondhand bookstores and libraries. In the 90s, there were no Bond reprints in the US, so I was stuck as a budding Bond fan, desperate to read all of the novels, having to do so in a scattershot manner whenever I could find a stray copy here and there in a library or a used bookshop. And so, had I been trying to read the Bond novels for the first time now, I would have been stuck reading these edited versions and probably not had any idea that they were edited. And it would not be the same experience. So, again, I think it's insulting the reader's intelligence. I think it's insulting the work of Fleming. I think it's insulting Fleming's literary legacy, no matter how well intentioned this process was. It's an insult. That's exactly what it is. It's an insult to everyone and everything involved, really, when you look at it. And I am trying to make this as polite a case as possible. I really had to try and think about how to put my feelings into words. There have already been some great Bond channels and other YouTube channels that have done videos on this topic, but I wanted to also make some other literary editing references as well to talk about different types of this issue occurring in the past. It's not a new thing, but the intensity to which this is going to go across all of literature moving on, no matter who the author is or how legendary the work is, this is going to be a particular issue that's going to continue, unfortunately. It really stings that it's the estate doing this. And I believe their intentions were good, but this has been taken way too far, and collectively we as Bond fans, I think, need to put our foot down and say, no, this is not right. So I strongly encourage anyone to read the original text and to go out of your way to not support this type of censorship and revisionism 70 years after the fact. Again, do not purchase these editions, do not read these editions, do not support this revisionism, and again, I think bookstores and libraries should refuse to stock altered works. So those are just my general thoughts. Again, I tried to make this as factual and as on point as I possibly could. And again, I'm still flabbergasted and really incensed that the estate decided to do this in this way and really do it in a sort of scattershot and manner where the edits and changes are sort of a hodgepodge of materials. Until these altered versions come out, we won't know the extent of which all the changes are going to be. But it's already looking like it's going to be a total mess, and it's something that just should not have happened. All that was required was a simple disclaimer or introduction talking about this particular issue and the notion of historical context. It truly is an insult to both the reader's intelligence and Fleming's work. It truly is. So do not support this in any way, shape, or form, and it really tarnishes the 70th anniversary of the literary 007, and I'm just still flabbergasted. So I know that's unfortunately a very negative response, but I think that's the response any sensible Bond fan will have to this news, and I just wanted to put my thoughts in video form and just try to express some of my just sheer. It's really unbelievable that the estate decided to do this in this way, and then the responses have been very simplistic and kind of even more infuriating because they don't go into a lot of detail, and what they do say is basically underlining their position that they have the right to second guess Fleming in 2023, 70 years on after the fact. So again, I encourage people to delve deeply into the Literary 007 if you haven't before, especially for the 70th anniversary, and to read the original texts of Fleming and whatever versions you are able to obtain. And whatever you do, do not support this type of censorship and just complete revisionism.